Hello, welcome back to my channel. I am Four Corners of the Page. I'm really glad you're here, and today this is going to be video number 2 in what will probably be a trilogy, possibly a quartet of videos about Stephen King. As I mentioned in that previous video, which was much more of an introduction, or my perspective on King and what I think about him, and some things that I think people get wrong about him, is that I've read a lot of Stephen King books. By my last count, I think I've read 60 of his paperbacks. Yeah, and that's been since 2012. It's now 2025, 13 years later. And I just find that every year or so I read 4 or 5 of his works. And that has kind of accumulated, that's kind of snowballed into this massive corpus of literature that I've read. So that first video was an introduction. The second video, as you can tell, is going to be kind of a tier list ranking of those Stephen King books, which I'll get to in just a second. And then the third video, I think I'm going to do a little video on where to start with Stephen King. If you've heard his name everywhere, but you don't know which book to jump in on, which is understandable because I'm looking at about 80 different editions of novels in front of me. So I want to make that. Yeah, Stephen King has always been this author that has been with me all the time. I've never not had a Stephen King book that I haven't read somewhere in the house, to be honest. Even when I'm, between places or just kind of hanging out somewhere for a couple of months, I will have a Stephen King book that I do want to get to at some point. So I thought, listen, let's put them in a line. Because I like to do that. And what better place to do it than in the middle of this trilogy that I'm making. So here are the rules. I have got a bunch of categories. I've probably got a little bit overboard, but you can forgive me. I've got top 5, amazing, great, good, average, poor, and I forgot. I'll get to these next 2 underneath in just a minute. Now, the reason I've structured it in this way is I kind of don't think Stephen King writes poor books. You might disagree with me there. I think the bigger thing that happens with Stephen King for 95% of the time is his books are either good or forgettable. And that's why I've added this bottom column in. I do think there's a significant number of his books, while not being bad, very readable, very enjoyable, go in one ear and out the other. And as I was looking down this list in preparation for this video, I realized that there's more of those than just books that I find overall poor. I'd say there are only 3 or 4 books that I find are just kind of not very good, which we'll get to. I've also just got down here, you can see, books I haven't read, which seems to be in about the 20 books mark, something like that, 15 to 20. I think there are more, so I'm wondering if this tier list is kind of omitting 1 or 2. And underneath I've also put the short story collections. I have read most of these. I have not read Different Seasons, and I've not read You Like It Darker, which makes me think of the Leonard Cohen song. I don't know if that's intentional. I'm excited to get to them. I just, I didn't want to spend your time sitting here in front of the computer thinking, have I read that? Yes, I have. What stories are inside? Bit of a waste of everyone's time. So we're going to skip those for now. What I will say is that I do think Stephen King is a really good short story writer. I think his short stories are very audiobookable as well. Novellas and short stories like 1408 is brilliant. The Jaunt, oh, fabulous. What else? Oh, there's just so many good. The Little Sisters of Illyria, wonderful. There's so many books within these collections, whether you want to call them novellas or short stories, that are really worth your time. I actually think Stephen King is an exceptionally talented short story writer, and that should probably be teased out a little bit more. We kind of talk about It and The Stand and Carrie and all of those, and because these books are kind of bundled into bigger collections, anthologies, we don't really focus on them so much. So maybe there's a video on that in the future. In fact, yes, there is. I will do that. There you go. You've heard it here first. The last thing I need to say before I start ranking is I'm going to do 30 seconds per book. Now, I have stolen this idea shamelessly from Matt's Fantasy Book Reviews, who did this, I believe. I'll link the video down below. I think it was his 2023 or 2024 kind of year end, where he talked about every single book he read that year, but he gave himself 30 seconds per book. I think that's very sensible. I don't want to be here for 2 hours, and it will also teach me the art of brevity, I thought, which is not a bad thing to learn at this stage in my booktube career. I'm not going to go in order. I'm just going to look at them as they come, and I'll try again, aim for a bit of a bell curve, but it might be more of a bimodal distribution between kind of really good books and I forgot, is what I suspect is going to happen. But your guess is as good as mine. So with that said, I'm going to start this timer. 30 seconds, here we go. And I am going to start with The Long Walk, which I think is amazing, if it will move up for me. Yeah, I think it's a really great book. Apparently he wrote this when he was like 19 in like a week. It is a fabulous novel. And it goes by like that. It's one of the original Death Game books. And the premise is basically that you have 100 boys who start walking. I think they have to go above 100 miles an hour, 3 miles an hour, until one of them is left. And you get shot if you don't make it that far. And you're watching this harrowing reducing of this number down to 0. And it is gripping and it is fast. You can read it in an afternoon, and I would thoroughly recommend it. And that is very fast, isn't it? So that's The Long Walk. We're going to move on to Gerald's Game, which I think is the lighter side of good. Again, you can read this in a day. it's a really dark novel. Those flashbacks are really horrible to read. I love the premise of this main character just sitting handcuffed to her bedpost in really, it's kind of 127 hours, but with a bedpost. And they had this idea of there's something watching her in the dark, and you don't find out what that is until the very last minute. It's a really good book, just not one of my favorites, I would say. I think I'm quite good at this. Okay, moving on. The Dead Zone. Do you know what? Am I going to regret this? Top 5. I don't know if this is me inserting my nostalgia, because I read this at a really formative time in my life when I was just finishing up university, but I think The Dead Zone is wonderful. Basically, the idea is that you have this character, he wakes up from a coma and can suddenly see the future when he touches someone, and he shakes the future president's hand and realizes that there is a nuclear war coming, something like that, and it is just such a wild ride, and the ending is so phenomenal. This is hard. Okay, let's go for one that's a bit easier. I am going to talk about Cycle of the Werewolf, because I think this is actually one of Stephen King's poorer works. I don't think he put much thought into this. I think it's a graphic novel, or an illustrated novel talking about a werewolf that kind of takes over a small town, comes after a small town. It's just not substantial enough to be worthwhile. There's not a whole lot that's really going on here. It kind of feels like he wrote this in an hour and a half and then just sent it off to the publishers and someone else did the illustrations. It is, above all, an extremely forgettable piece of work. Much like me. Okay, moving on. Let's do Firestarter, which I'm going to put in as average. I was kind of bored. I switched to the audiobook halfway through to get through it. I love the start. I love this father-daughter relationship that goes on with Firestarter. But as the book goes on, I just kind of felt like it was outstaying its welcome. I don't think the kind of magical, ethereal side of it was very substantial. I don't think it was supposed to be. I did love all the stuff that was interesting in this novel happened before the main event of the novel. All these flashbacks when you kind of get into that family dynamic is brilliant, but the novel itself, not my favourite. Okay, but we're going to go to one that I think is really good. We're going to go for Dreamcatcher, which I'm going to put as amazing or great. The one word to describe this book, right, is feverish. Lots of people hate this book. It's right at the bottom for them. Stephen King wrote it just after he had his car accident where he was hit by a car. So it's lots of body horror, lots of kind of strange deaths that kind of come out of nowhere. But I love it for that. I don't think I've ever read a Stephen King book where I just did not know what was going to happen or how it was going to end up. This was a man who was deeply unwell when he was writing it, and it shows, but it's such a good time. But we're going to move on. Oh, I could probably put that one in. Great or amazing? Top of great. Tippy top of great. The Gunslinger. Amazing. I don't care. Right? People say don't start with the Gunslinger. You shouldn't start with the Gunslinger. I have read this book 5 or 6 times now. It is short and sweet and weird and mystical and magical and wonderful. It's got that best opening sentence that everyone knows. It's better on a reread. The language is gorgeous, coming from a boy who basically wrote it, from what I understand, and maybe he tidied it up a lot down the years. The start to the Dark Tower series, it is so much better than people give it credit for. Might not be for everyone, it certainly is for me. And before I do the next one, I've just realised that Bag of Bones I have not actually read. Apologies. There's probably going to be a couple of these. Where'd it go? Bag of Bones, come back. Haven't read you. Looking forward to you though. Let's move on to Insomnia, which I would actually put as a great book. Do you know what? No. Flip the haters, right? Insomnia is amazing. People talk about it as a slow, dreary novel that doesn't really go anywhere. The perspective of this novel from an older man, I think he's about 70, this man Ralph, I believe his name is. I read this book like 10 years ago, but it still stays with me. That idea of kind of, as his sleep goes away, things become more and more unspooled. But again, what the heart of this book is that kind of found family dynamic. I need more time to talk about Insomnia. I need to reread that book. Let's go for one that I do not love quite as much, which is Dolores Claiborne. Average. Poor? No, it's not poor. It's past Firestarter. Really interesting novel. Kind of takes place, I believe Stephen King wrote it in the 90s. About all perspective from this older woman who's kind of narrating back on her life, I believe. It was the first half I prefer much more to the second half, when she's kind of talking about her marriage. I won't go into that. But the voice is the strength of this novel, but the actual plot of the novel itself I did not find personally particularly engaging. Maybe I'm just the wrong audience. It's not one of my favourites. Where are we going to go from here? Should we do a top 5? Everyone loves On Writing. Am I running out of top 5s too early? Everyone loves On Writing. They should love On Writing. And you know what? I would even say you should read On Writing if you're not a writer. Stephen King's non-fiction narrative voice is really interesting. He talks about his history with addiction and alcoholism. The biographical element here is sublime. And you do have these really interesting tips and tools that he advises you based on writing, with lots of anecdotes from the different novels and the novelists and stuff. I think it's wonderful. Not as a writer, but as a teacher, I do genuinely think this book is wonderful. And it's going to stay in the top 5, but it might not stay the whole way through. Let's move on to a different book. Shall we do another Dark Tower book? Oh no! Do you know what's going to happen? Drawing of the Three is my favourite Stephen King book. This was the book that sold Stephen King to me. There is a moment about 2/3 through this book, and I understand this book has a lot of flaws. Without getting into spoilerific territory, I think that the romance that happens here is pretty dry and dim. But the start of this book and the realization about something about 2/3 into this book, I rarely actually do this, but closed the book and went, oh my goodness, which is very rare for Stephen King, because you can often, he's not a big twist guy, and the plot here is one of his best. I'm cheating. Cujo. Oh, fight me. It's good. It's better than Gerald's Game. I love the story. I audiobooked it, and I sometimes wonder when I audiobook things if I rate them slightly lower just through some kind of unconscious bias, but I do think Stephen King's really good at that narrative voice that's good for audiobooks. I'm not talking about Cujo. Cujo's a great book. And it's got more heart than I thought it did have when I heard about Cujo first through Friends, and that reference where I think Rachel watches Cujo. This novel is all heart, and what actually happens to Cujo is heartbreaking, which was really surprising. We're gonna keep going. From a Buick is hot garbage. Where are you? One of the few Stephen King books that just bored me. Had some promise in the beginning with this. I believe it's a son of a policeman, and he kind of gets adopted by the police station. There's supposed to be an air of mystery around From a Buick. I've not read Christine. People have told me that From a Buick is just kind of like a worse Christine. Doesn't do anything nearly as interesting. I certainly had a tough time with it. I was counting down the minutes. Probably should have DNF'd it, but I'm too stubborn. Don't really recommend. Unless you're a completionist. Doomakey is really fabulous. I don't think it's bottom of great. I don't think it's quite... I haven't hit start. All right, Doomakey, you get an extra 30 seconds. I read this book last year, just before I moved to Kuwait. And I loved it. I spent about 50 pages a night over about a week and a half reading this book. It is classic, cozy Stephen King. Man moves to a new scenario, builds up a network of friends, discovers himself, that kind of thing that Stephen King does really well. Did it outstay its welcome? Slightly. Was the ending a little bit deflating? Yes. Kind of some elements of The Shining here. But really good book. Don't think it quite deserves the accolades that Stephen King fans call it one of his sleeper hits. I don't think it's that good. I think it's really good. Colorado Kid. I hate this book. I really hate this book. And the thing is, I can't really talk about this book without spoiling it. Because I hate what this book does towards the end. I don't think I've finished a Stephen King book, apart from two more that I'll get to, that I just find so irredeemable. I loved it right up until the last 30 pages. And then it just all fell apart to me. I totally respect what it was trying to do, and it kind of accomplishes what it's trying to do, but I hate what it's trying to do, and I cannot. It's poor. Don't know if that's a hot take. Fight me. I'm right. I'm opinionated. This, last thing on a Sunday. Should I do another one I don't like? Yeah, go on. Eyes of the Dragon. Bottom of average, top of poor. I just find this book a bit like From a Buick, but not quite as bad. Just a bit boring. It's a fantasy fairy tale story that has huge Dark Tower elements, but just feels like a kid's book. It does not feel like Stephen King. It feels like a very talented, much softer, lighter writer adopted Stephen King's book, and I was just waiting for the pages to end. Man, there's more clunkers in here than I thought there'd be. And there's no I Forgot so far. But we're going to fix that, because Rage, to be honest, I PDF'd this one. For those of you who know, Rage is one of these books that has Stephen King's taken off the shelves. From what I recall, I read this again about 10 years ago. Takes place from the perspective of a school shooter, which is understandably controversial. That's why Stephen King pulled it. I remember the voice being quite nasty of this first-person protagonist, who is, again, the school shooter. Again, if you're a real Stephen King diehard fan, you could look it up and read it. I've forgotten most of it, which is quite damning in and of itself. You're not really missing that much. Where are we going to go from here? Carrie is pretty much the benchmark for me of what a good Stephen King book is, or a really good Stephen King book. It does everything in a little crisp 220, 230 pages. He wrote this again when he was 21, 22. It's almost like one of those quintessential horror kind of classics at this point. Utterly deserving of its reputation as being this tight little horror story, really kind of puts Stephen King forth as one of the narrative voices of his generation, but doesn't do anything particularly remarkable for Stephen King. So I'll put it there. Where are we going to move on to from here? It is amazing, but not top 5. Here. You know what I'm going to say. I think there's a scene in this book that everyone knows that is infamous and does just let the side down. And I wish it was taken out and it might be top 5, but every time I think about it, I just can't help but think about the scene, which I know people try to justify. I just find inherently unjustifiable and really awkward. And I can't really recommend this book without that. It does bring it down a notch for me. Green Mile. Amazing. Wonderful. Totally deserving its reputation. I love that Stephen King can just take this horror writer, this kind of supernatural writer with these horror elements, and make this amazing piece of literary fiction, which is utterly deserving of its reputation. It's episodic, if you don't know. It's actually, I think, 6 kind of micro, I think they're released maybe in the newspapers or magazines or something, and then got bundled together into this novel. It is wonderful, it is tragic, it is heartbreaking. Almost everyone knows the story of the Green Mile, and it is still worth your time. The Wastelands. I've got to talk about it. I'm wasting time. Here, it's good. It's a really good Dark Tower book. Slight step down for me from The Drawing of the Three, which is my favourite Dark Tower book. I think that it's a really excellent incorporation of the first 2 books. Kind of slams those 2 elements, the otherworldly and the New Yorkish setting, right together. But there's a couple of elements here I find slightly cringy. And yeah. But it's still super, super high. Don't get me wrong. I don't think I love this book as much as other people do. I thought I talked about Cujo. Why is Cujo here? Did it just slot back down? Where did I put Cujo? Oh, I put the Running Man here. Apologies. Well, you're going to be mad at me. Right, let's do the Running Man then. Sorry if you've been looking at that and it's been giving you an itch. I just guess I clicked the wrong one. Apologies. The Running Man, though, is great. Oh, I like the Running Man. Again, you can read this in a day. I think I read this in about 4 or 5 hours. I think Stephen King wrote it in a week. Again, a death game. Stephen King, I think, doesn't deserve. No, he has a lot of death game scenarios in his books, and he doesn't get a reputation so much as a death game author. But The Running Man is a wonderful death game book that I'd say is more heart-wrenching and intimidating than something like Squid Game, and even than The Long Walk, which I think is a slightly superior work. Really like that. Apologies. Let's move on to The Stand. I'm worried that I'm going to have to shunt something up the top 5, but The Stand is top 5. You can't not rate The Stand high. I read this book feverishly, there's that word again, over the course of about 7 or 8 days, and I just adored it. I was spellbound by this work. I've been really meaning to read Swan Song, which I heard is kind of like a twin of this book by Robert McCammon, which I will get to, but I was enraptured by this book. I love the ending too. I know that the ending is controversial generally, as Stephen King books are. I thought it wrapped up really well. Where are we going to go from here? Should we do another terrible one? Cell. No, Cell's not average. This feels like Stephen King fan fiction. There's something off about the voice here. When I opened up Cell, I had the cheap, 50-cent paperback on my shelf for ages, brought it down, decided to read it over a weekend, and I was just severely disappointed. Phones turning people into zombies, okay, that's fine. I mean, the horror element, it's what Stephen King does with the horror element, but this book just never really picked up steam for me. It felt like someone was really imitating Stephen King's voice and not doing a great job with it. And it's all about the voice for Stephen King, isn't it? So that was a bit of a disappointment for me. Right, where are we going now? This is a controversial one. Salem's Lot, I think, is kind of like the Beatles, so we're making it even more controversial. I respect it for what it did at the time. It's not my favourite. I would not reread this over and over. I kind of have the same thing about the Beatles, which, forgive me, I don't know if anyone's going to unsubscribe because of that. I can look at it and I can enjoy it immensely, and I can see its place in time is really important, and I kind of talked about Stephen King as a transition from old horror to new horror, but the book itself, yeah, I can take it or leave it. I'm a Bob Dylan fan. Wizard and Glass. I need to reread this. I do. It's better than The Wastelands. I remember really enjoying it, but I'll be honest, I have not. It's fully better than The Gunslinger. I would probably flip these on a reread, but for now, The Gunslinger, I can remember most pages of that novel. A lot of Wizard and Glass, which is a lot of a longer book, has kind of faded into the background, but it's a really great, basically extended flashback that takes everything from the multiverse and sticks it together in a really satisfying way. Amazing. Really great book. How are we doing so far? How's it looking? More positive than negative. Okay, only one I forgot. Let's do another I forgot. Desperation. I'm kind of lying here. I remember the first half of this book very vividly, but for whatever reason, the second half just hasn't really stuck with me. Like the monster in the mines. I have so little to say about this book. I just take a really extended sip of coffee. That opening sequence was really good, wasn't it? The policeman in the car and that stuff I really loved, but as soon as everyone, the gang gets together, it just sort of fades into the background for me. Maybe I need a reread. Under the Dome. Poor. Again, I'm kind of reserving poor. I'm using that as synonymous with boring, because I was looking forward to Under the Dome. I brought this on holiday. I was so excited. I thought I was going to get another Stand, even Insomnia. And instead, what I kind of got was just this trundle of pages, which didn't ever really stick the landing for me. I kind of found the ending quite unsatisfying. Don't think the characters were particularly enjoyable, which you really need for these big, long, epic books. It just didn't really cohere for me, so I'm going to put it as poor. You could probably argue that it's average, but we'll keep it at poor for now. Rose Madder is this going to make sense? A great average book. This book also, like Dreamcatcher, is kind of seen as a bit of a, what's the word? One of the bottom strata of King's books. I think it's really good. It's horrible. the picture it paints of domestic abuse is really really harrowing, and it's really lovely to see that kind of recovery that Stephen King does. The villain is one note deliberately. It's a good book, but I don't think it excels anywhere near the top of the pile. I'm being quite hesitant. I'll tell you what my thought process is here. I've got one more top 5 before I start sending things down. It's not going to be The Shining. 11/22/63 is my second favourite Stephen King book. It just is. I love this. The ending is I can't talk about the ending. Actually, I'm not going to talk about the ending because I don't want to spoil it. This is a wonderful book, and it's so different. Again, often you find that Stephen King will just have like 3 or 4 kind of sequential, kind of similar books, and then this next book will just be like magnificently different. And you can tell he's put his research into this book. Main character, a bit of a nothing burger, but we enjoy him. But again, that coziness of Stephen King has never been more on display, and the climax at the end is just wonderful. Jake, I think his name is, the nothing protagonist. Now, I don't know if this says more about my fading memory. Billy Summers I've pretty much forgotten, and I read it about 2 years ago. Hitman. In a room. Assassination. There's a guy with liver problems. Nothing really sticks. And it's really fascinating, because most of the other ones I'm going to put in I forgot, I read maybe a decade ago. This one I think I read in 2022, 2023. But for some reason it's just faded into the background. It's just noise. And I wonder why that is. Maybe it was overstuffed. Or maybe not enough meat on the bones. That was a waste of everyone's time, wasn't it? And you know what? We're going to do the same with Gwenny's Button Box. Forgive me for doing 2 in a row. I kind of remember this one. Again, I read it on my Kindle on my phone on a train, and maybe that's the reason that I forgot it a little bit. It reminded me, as I was reading it, I remember that it was very much like that Richard Matheson short story, the idea that you press a button and you get $20,000, $100,000, but someone in the world dies. You know, you have this object that you press, and good or bad things will kind of happen, or good and bad will happen at the same time, which is an interesting concept, but I think it's done better by the way. Maybe I do remember it. But the main character, Gwendy, apparently doesn't really stick. Just that actual premise is what sticks. Wolves of the Cala is a great Stephen King book. I do agree that the back half of The Dark Tower is not quite as strong for me as the first half. Wolves of the Cala is still really great though, and I love that we kind of spend a bit more time in Midworld. I love that there's kind of more incorporation of how to say pop culture in these books. I love the idea of the characters have really kind of stepped forward, especially Roland. When you look at him from book 1 to book 5, there's growth there. There's also suffering there. You really feel like you've travelled with these characters. Yeah, I need to do a reread of The Dark Tower. Blaze is average. Not bad average. I put it with Morose Matter. I enjoyed it for what it was. Dolores Claiborne, kind of a riff off a modern day take of Mice and Men, kind of in a way. You have this, if Mice and Men was told from Lenny's perspective, it kind of feels like, but a bit more grim, a bit more kind of crime related. It was fine. I enjoyed it. Again, you can rip through it and then forget about it later. Again, average, I wouldn't necessarily not recommend them. Certainly Dolores Claiborne and above, I would recommend, but Blaze is not one that really sticks in, you know, the top tier by any stretch. Tell you what though, really good book. In fact, I should do The Shining before we get to Doctor Sleep. The Shining's amazing. It would be top 5. I'm not willing to bump any of these off for The Shining, but The Shining absolutely deserves to be where it is. Book is better than the movie. I am totally with Stephen King. The heart of The Shining is this broken, angry man who is trying to do better and gets sucked into this really nasty situation that is the Overlook Hotel. And I think the Kubrick movie is so different. I mean, maybe not worse, but different. It takes that humanity out of it, which I find really uncomfortable, but I love The Shining. I really adore this book. And the fact I read it as my third Stephen King book in 2012, and I remember so much about it, speaks volumes. I'm cheating. Doctor Sleep, I would say, is a very worthy sequel. I put it at the top of great. If we're going to keep talking about movies, I love that we return to Danny Torrance, and that's a really clever, interesting, generational move. The movie's better. The movie blew me away. I just thought that adaptation was wonderful. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think that director is now in charge to direct The Dark Tower. I hope that's right, because, I loved that adaptation so much. It felt long, but luxuriously long, and the book is great too. Apologies for just going completely off the assignment there. We have about 15 books left? Apologies. I know that's terrible, because I would rank The Dark Tower as one of my favourite fantasy series of all time, if I ever get around to making that video. But for some reason, I've only read those first 3 books multiple times. 4, I think, once or twice, and then 5 through 7 once. And for some reason, book 6 just hasn't cemented itself in my mind. There are things I remember about this book. The metafictional element to it, I very much remember. The ending and what kind of goes on there. Really? I need to reread Song of Susanna. This is the Dark Tower book that just hasn't quite stuck in my head. Thinner is... Again, top end of average, bottom end of good. I think I mentioned this channel before. I have health anxiety. Body horror stuff I can find quite difficult sometimes, although I loved Dreamcatcher. The idea of this man getting thinner and thinner and wasting away because of a curse is a little bit hackneyed and old-fashioned. It did draw me in. I couldn't say I enjoyed it very much, but I thought it was really excellently done. Richard Bachman book, if I'm remembering rightly. I felt this was a really good book for what it was. Very thin, ironically. Pet Sematary. In any other author's canon, this would be a top 5. Haunting. No, After the Gunslinger. Does everything it wants to, and what it wants to do is just horrifying. There is a line in this novel that I referenced in my previous video, and you already know what it is if you've read the book. The most heartbreaking line in any Stephen King book, certainly. But really, I can't think of a more heartbreaking line in general. That just, everyone knows the plot of Pet Sematary. You probably know what I'm talking about vaguely. Extremely bleak novel. Extremely bleak novel. Later is the bottom end of average. Yeah, there. I wanted to like this book. I had a quite good time with this book. Definite flavours of The Shining. But doesn't really do much more than that. It kind of feels like a callback to King's earlier works rather than its own organic novel. The ending, kind of like It, if you know what I'm talking about, did leave a bit of a sour note in my mouth. Didn't think it was particularly well executed. How can the man who wrote 11/22/63, I hope this alarm isn't too obnoxious. How can the man who wrote 11/22/63 within the same kind of span of years write later? I don't know. But The Dark Tower itself, that book 7, people like to hate on it. Yeah, it does everything at once. I think I've said that a few times over the course of this novel. People are deflated by this book. They don't think that the ending sticks the landing. I would disagree. I think everything about that back 300 pages is exactly as King intended. I think that it's this wonderful, marvellous, can't say too much about it, but I really enjoy what The Dark Tower does. I really hope that alarm isn't too bad. We're down to the final 9, 10, 9, because those ones I haven't read. Mr. Mercedes, I need to reread. I want to reread this one before. There's all these Holly Gibney books. Holly Gibney is her name. And I feel like I need to reread Mr. Mercedes before I can get to the other Bill Hodges stuff, before I can get to Holly the Outsider, all these books that now have Holly as the protagonist. I need to reread Mr. Mercedes before I can do that, I think. I like this book. Solid crime book. I love the premise. Couple of awkward notes, perhaps, but yeah, absolutely a great kind of thriller-style book that is worth reading. I've heard that he goes off the deep end later in the trilogy, but I haven't actually read them, so I don't know. Went Through the Keyhole. Do you know what? I'm going to put it with I forgot. I do remember parts of this. I remember the structure. I think the structure is magnificent. I don't remember that central story very well. I remember the stories that kind of braid it, that bookend it, but that central plot that's about 150 pages long, I would need to reread. It's kind of separate from The Dark Tower anyway, but I should really do a reread of The Dark Tower, because it's a shame that a series that I find so beloved, there's two of them that I struggle to articulate very much about. Fairy Tale. I have not finished this book. I'm 200 pages from the end. Currently, I would put it somewhere between good and great. I think that the first half of the novel is better so far. I'm yet to get to the climax. That could turn around, but the first half of Fairy Tale is amazing. I loved it to pieces, and I'm finding myself less engaged with the second half, but there's still a ways to go. I would suspect that if that trajectory continues, I might push it down to a good, but I cannot see it going into the average category. I think that first half is so wonderful. It really is a novel of two halves. Elevation. Fine. Good. I enjoyed it. Rose Madder. Blaze. It exists. 150 pages long. I think this is Stephen King's shortest novel. This could really be part of a short story collection, if I'm honest. Maybe it should be. Again, similar notes. I don't think it does anything particularly special. There's a bit of political moralizing, but not something that an issue that I particularly have any. I didn't really dislike that at all, but it felt quite prominent. Yeah, I would enjoy this. I'd recommend it. I'd buy it for someone. Again, it's kind of like Rose Mather. It just doesn't quite reach higher up for me. Misery's great. Misery deserves its reputation. I think I would probably put it as great, a touch lower than everyone else. I think this book is fabulous. I read it in a day. I took a bus from, where was it? Colorado to New Mexico, about a 10-hour bus, and I read this old first edition hardback, and I finished it just as we pulled into this the station, and it was just this wonderful sort of, again, maybe I'm taking my memories and I'm kind of colouring retrospectively how I actually found the book, but I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great, very atmospheric, legitimately terrifying character of Annie Wilkes. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. I really enjoyed this. You know what? Great. Little girl lost in the woods. I think about 200 pages long. Again, a very short read. She gets lost from. Oh, forgive me. Maybe I should put this and I forgot. No, because I do remember it. The story of these two parents searching together for this girl who is wandering, listening to the character of Tom Gordon, and again, just that kind of creepy atmosphere. I didn't articulate that one very well at all. I think 50 books in, I'm beginning to feel that fatigue. But I remember having a really good time with this book. Right, three books left. Roadwork. Yeah, average. I can't say I enjoyed this Bachman book very much. The ending is really, I was going to say lovely. I wouldn't say lovely. Engaging. But I feel like there's a whole lot of kind of administrative build-up to that ending, which I didn't quite enjoy particularly. I kind of felt like it was plodding towards this climax, and I think I've said previously on this channel, I kind of have an issue with books that just feel like everything is just set up. For the last 50 pages. I don't find that particularly rewarding. I find that a bit tedious. And Roadwork is kind of guilty of that. I would probably need to reread Joyland. I'd kind of put it with The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon. One of these shorter books, much more of a coming-of-age story about a young man kind of on the precipice of adolescence to manhood. Kind of a thriller-type story. Very much kind of about the atmosphere and the vibes. I think Stephen King is really good as well when he's reminiscing about the past. And I can't remember if this book is set in the present day or kind of towards the past, but it has that kind of longing for the past and the olden days, which I think Stephen King does really well. And then we have Revival. Next to Misery. I think this is a book that people don't praise enough. What can I say about Revival? There is something about Revival. The ending. Can't talk about the ending. everyone knows if you read it what I'm talking about, that really does kind of skew, when you can't really talk about Rival without talking about the ending. There's really two kind of parts of this book, isn't there? There's the novel itself, and then there's the last kind of bit, but I can't talk about it without spoiling. But I really enjoyed this. There's such a tonal flip, though. Oh my goodness, it's got everything. That is me done, though. How do I think? What do I think about this? Drawing of the 3, 11, 22, 63, Dead Zone, Stand On Writing. Yeah, I'd probably put Dead Zone at the end. Moving down, we've got some amazing and great books, and I'd say that a lot of Stephen King books are up there. And we've got kind of a flutter, what's that, about 20, 25 books that are kind of ranging from good to I forgot. And I would agree with this. I think there's only 5 Stephen King books that I would argue are truly poor, and I wouldn't recommend to people. Everything from, I would say, Firestarter and above would be a good Stephen King book. But yeah, let me know what you think. I'm going to just very quickly go down to the haven't read. Dance Macabre, Tommy Knocker's Dark Half, did I pronounce that right? Too late. Needful Things, The Regulators, Lacey's Story, Gwenny's Final Task, Sleeping Beauties, End of Watch, Holly, Finders Keepers, Christine the Outsider, The Institute, Talisman, Black House, Bag of Bones. Those are the ones I haven't read. If you have read any of those, would you recommend them based on what I've just described as my pre-existing taste? The ones that I would say I'm quite keen to get to, Lacey's Story I've already mentioned. I'm really keen to get the Holly Gibney stuff. Talisman I've heard is really good and very Dark Tower centered. I don't know how I haven't gotten to that. I have a copy just over there. And also the Tommy Knockers. I kind of really want to read the Tommy Knockers. Everyone hates it, but just based on the fact that I really enjoyed Dreamcatcher, and I really enjoyed, what was the other one that everyone hates that I really enjoyed? Insomnia. I think I might have quite a good time with the Tommy Knockers. Let me know what you think. Thank you for making your way through this video. I hope it wasn't too wittery. And please look out for my third video, which is going to be on the 5 Stephen King books I think you should start with, which aren't necessarily going to be those top 5. I'll definitely have a bit of a spread. So thanks for watching as always. See you in the next one, and peace.